The crisp, pine-scented air of Oakhaven, nestled deep within the Sierra Nevada foothills, always held a comforting chill, even in the heart of summer. For David Miller, a man whose broad shoulders and weathered hands spoke of a life spent battling the fury of nature, it was the only home he'd ever known. David, at 42, was a legend among the regional fire services, not just for his bravery, though that was undeniable, etched into every scar and hard-won commendation, but for his unyielding commitment to the community. His own modest cabin, built by his grandfather, overlooked the sprawling ancient forests he swore to protect, a solitary sentinel amidst the towering trees. Life for David had always been defined by duty, by the roaring infernos that threatened homes and lives, and by the quiet camaraderie of his fellow smoke jumpers. But a different kind of fire had recently consumed his world, one that left ashes in its wake and a hollow ache in his chest, the loss of his beloved wife, Sarah Thompson, just 8 months prior. A sudden, cruel rock slide on a treacherous mountain pass had claimed her, leaving David with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight, one he carried silently through every shift and every lonely evening. The only ember of hope in his desolate life was his young son, Nicholas Miller, a bright-eyed boy who had just turned 6 when the tragedy struck. Nicholas, like a fragile sapling after a devastating burn, had survived the immediate impact of the loss, but the joy and boisterous energy that once defined him had withered away. He retreated into an impenetrable silence, a world of his own making, where words seemed to have no place. David would try every morning and every night to coax a sound, a smile, anything from his son, but Nicholas's gaze remained distant, his small body often tensed, as if perpetually braced for another unseen blow. The once vibrant little boy who used to chatter incessantly about fire trucks and woodland creatures was gone, replaced by a ghost of his former self. David had spent every spare cent, every hour not dedicated to saving others, on finding a way to save his son. He'd consulted specialists across the state, his firefighter's pension dwindling with each appointment, each experimental therapy. He was desperate, a man used to taking decisive action against an enemy he could see and fight, now helpless against an adversary that lurked within his own child. His journey led him to Dr. Patricia Johnson, a renowned child psychologist based in the bustling city 2 hours away, known for her groundbreaking work in childhood trauma and neurological disorders. Dr. Johnson, a woman of impeccable credentials and a carefully cultivated air of detached authority, had a clinical detachment that sometimes grated on David, but her reputation was undeniable. After a series of extensive, costly evaluations, neurological scans, behavioral assessments, and countless hours of observation, Dr. Johnson delivered her devastating verdict. "Mr. Miller," she had begun, her voice even, almost rehearsed, "Nicholas exhibits all the hallmarks of a severe latent childhood disintegrative disorder, CDD. The trauma in his case seems to have been the precipitating factor, essentially activating the underlying condition." She explained it with scientific precision, speaking of neuronal pathways and developmental regressions, describing a future of intensive, long-term care, specialized medications to manage behavioral outbursts, and a lifetime of limited communication. She assured David that with her advanced therapy protocols, developed and championed by her own research at the prestigious Johnson Institute, they could manage Nicholas's symptoms and provide him with the best possible quality of life. David, numb with the news, saw his last savings disappear into the maw of this new terrifying diagnosis, but he would have sold his very soul if it meant helping his son. The Johnson Institute was quickly becoming the new center of his universe, a fortress of hope built on the shaky ground of a bewildering medical condition. For the next 10 months, Nicholas's life became a meticulously scheduled regimen of therapy sessions at the Johnson Institute's satellite clinic in Oakhaven, supervised directly by Dr. Johnson's hand-picked team. There were daily sensory integration exercises, speech therapy attempts that yielded no words, and carefully titrated doses of medication meant to calm his perceived anxieties and reduce repetitive behaviors. David watched, his heart aching, as Nicholas moved through these sessions, his eyes often vacant, sometimes filled with a quiet distress that twisted David's gut. The boy occasionally would push away the therapists or stare blankly at the complex visual aids, his silence unbroken. David, exhausted from his shifts and emotionally drained, would return home to an empty house, only to find Nicholas more withdrawn than before, his small world shrinking further with each passing day. The financial burden was immense. David had liquidated his modest investments, taken out a second mortgage on his cabin, and picked up every overtime shift imaginable. He often worked double shifts, battling forest fires for days on end, his body screaming for rest, his mind perpetually worried about Nicholas. He saw the expensive medications piling up, the detailed invoices for therapy hours, and the endless reports from Dr. Johnson, all affirming the necessity of their intensive, ongoing interventions. He trusted her. She was the expert, the one who held the key to his son's future, even as a creeping, unsettling doubt sometimes gnawed at the edges of his conviction. The small, close-knit community of Oakhaven whispered behind cupped hands about David Miller's struggle, their hearts heavy for the brave firefighter and his suffering son. They saw the increasing strain in David's eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to slump a little more each day. But they also saw his unwavering dedication, his desperate fight for Nicholas. It was during one particularly grueling week, after battling a brush fire that raged for 3 days near the state park, that David realized he couldn't manage everything alone anymore. The cabin was falling into disarray, meals were sporadic, and he was simply too exhausted to provide the constant supervision Nicholas now required. He needed help, consistent and reliable. He placed an advertisement in the local paper, hoping to find someone trustworthy, someone kind, who could bring a semblance of order back into their fractured lives. The ad was simple: household manager, caregiver, needed for quiet boy, experience with children preferred. He wasn't looking for a miracle, just a steady hand. He certainly wasn't expecting Maria Davis. Maria, at 35, arrived on his doorstep a week later, her presence a quiet ripple in the turbulent waters of David's life. She was a woman whose background was in international caregiving, her English precise and clear, her demeanor reserved but observant. Her resume, though sparse on formal American experience, detailed a history of caregiving and a surprising background as a trained pediatric nurse, a detail she mentioned almost as an afterthought. David, desperate and recognizing a quiet strength in her eyes, hired her almost immediately. He explained Nicholas's condition, the CDD diagnosis, the rigid therapy schedule, and the need for a calm, structured environment. Maria listened intently, her dark eyes absorbing every detail, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them as he spoke of Dr. Johnson and the specific medications. Maria, he learned, had left her nursing career under a cloud of controversy back in Europe, a story she alluded to vaguely as a misunderstanding involving a powerful medical institution and a patient's misdiagnosis. It was a past she clearly preferred not to dwell on, and David, with his own heavy burdens, didn't press. He simply needed her help. Maria moved into the small guest cottage on David's property, a silent, steady presence that slowly began to weave itself into the fabric of their fractured lives. She cleaned, she cooked, and she tried, gently, to interact with Nicholas, never pushing, always patient. The boy remained in his cocoon of silence, but Maria's presence introduced a new, subtle rhythm to the house, a quiet consistency that was both new and oddly comforting. David watched her, a sliver of hope rekindled, wondering if this quiet woman with her gentle hands and her soothing melodic voice could somehow reach his son where all others had failed. He could only pray that this wouldn't be another dead end, another false dawn in his desperate search for a way to bring his Nicholas back. Maria's days in the Miller household quickly settled into a quiet, purposeful rhythm. She moved through the cabin with a practiced efficiency, her movements soft, almost imperceptible. She prepared simple, nourishing meals, ensured the house was immaculate, and meticulously followed the routines prescribed by Dr. Johnson for Nicholas's therapy. Yet beneath her professional facade, Maria harbored a growing disquiet. She observed Nicholas with an intensity born of her past nursing experience, a silent analysis that went beyond the superficial. She saw a quiet, distressed boy, yes, but not the rigid, unresponsive child described in Dr. Johnson's extensive reports. She noticed Nicholas's aversion to certain textures in his food, his flinching at sudden loud noises, his preference for deep, comforting pressure. These weren't necessarily the definitive markers of childhood disintegrative disorder, as she understood it from her training. Rather, they resonated with a different, more nuanced set of symptoms. The expensive medications meant to stabilize his mood and reduce aggression seemed to make him more lethargic, his eyes even more distant. Maria had seen the effects of such powerful pharmaceuticals before, and the vacantness in Nicholas's gaze worried her deeply. She spent hours in his room, not pushing therapy exercises but simply being there. She would fold laundry, humming soft old folk songs from her own childhood, her voice a low, melodic drone. She would sit on the floor quietly sorting toys, occasionally placing a soft stuffed animal near Nicholas without expectation. She noticed how he would sometimes lean into the vibrations of her humming, or how his gaze would subtly follow her movements, even if he didn't directly engage. These were tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, but to Maria, they were significant. David, meanwhile, was a man stretched to his absolute limits. The mountain fire season was particularly brutal that year, and he was often gone for days on end, fighting infernos that threatened to engulf the very landscape he loved. He would return home, bone-weary and smoke-stained, only to be confronted by the quiet, unchanging reality of Nicholas's condition. He relied heavily on Maria's detailed reports, her calm reassurances that she was adhering strictly to Dr. Johnson's protocols. He saw her dedication, her tireless patience with Nicholas, and felt a profound gratitude for her presence. Yet, the gnawing doubt, though suppressed, remained. He spent countless hours poring over medical journals online, trying to understand CDD, trying to reconcile the complex terminology with the silent boy he saw every day. He drained his remaining savings, even considered selling off a small parcel of land that had been in his family for generations, just to keep up with the mounting bills from the Johnson Institute. Dr. Johnson's reports always painted a picture of Nicholas's slow but steady progress, a narrative that conflicted sharply with the reality David witnessed. Nicholas was still nonverbal, still withdrawn, still seemed trapped behind an invisible wall. David felt a profound sense of helplessness, a firefighter powerless against an enemy he couldn't douse with water or cut off with a firebreak. His faith in Dr. Johnson was absolute. She was the authority, the only hope, yet the lack of tangible improvement was a constant crushing weight. He yearned for a sign, any sign that his son was still in there, waiting to be found. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, nearly 4 months after Maria had joined the household, the air hung heavy with the scent of pine and an approaching rainstorm. Maria was tidying Nicholas's room, humming a lullaby her grandmother used to sing, a melancholic tune about a lost bird. Nicholas was seated on the floor amidst a pile of wooden blocks, his back to her, seemingly lost in his own world. Maria noticed a discarded toy stethoscope near his hand, a gift from David after one of his fire station visits. She picked it up, a gentle smile playing on her lips, and without thinking, placed the cold metal disc against her own chest. "Oh dear," she murmured softly, playing along. "I think my heart is very sad today, little doctor. Can you make it better?" It was a spontaneous, unscripted moment, a tiny deviation from the rigid protocols. Nicholas, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, stirred. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned his head. His eyes, usually distant, focused on Maria. He reached out a small, hesitant hand, taking the toy stethoscope from her. Maria held her breath, not daring to move. Nicholas then, with painstaking slowness, placed the earpieces into his own ears, then pressed the disc to her chest. He listened, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. Maria could feel the warmth of his small fingers through her shirt, a spark of connection. Then a sound, a tiny, almost inaudible whisper, rough and unpracticed, but unmistakably a word. "Mama." Sad. Maria froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the first word she had heard from him. She barely dared to breathe, her eyes welling up with tears. "Yes, little doctor," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "Mama is a little sad, but you can make her better." Nicholas continued to listen. Then, with a profound sense of purpose, he gently pulled the stethoscope away. He looked up at Maria, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and then he did something utterly miraculous. He smiled, a small, tentative, yet undeniably genuine smile. He then pointed to his own chest, then to hers, and then, his gaze locked on hers, he spoke again, his voice still soft but stronger this time. "Mama, happy." The dam broke. Maria scooped him into her arms, hugging him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, my sweet boy," she sobbed. "Mama is so happy now." Unbeknownst to them, David had returned early from a short local patrol, weary and disheartened. As he approached the cabin, he heard Maria's muffled sobs and a sudden quiet murmur. He paused at the door to Nicholas's room, his hand on the knob, his breath hitched in his throat. He saw the embrace, the tears, and then he saw Nicholas, his son, his silent son, looking up at Maria, his face alight with a fragile, beautiful joy, and he heard the unmistakable word, soft but clear, "Mama." David staggered back, leaning against the hallway wall, a sob tearing through his own chest. His legs felt like jelly. He had just witnessed the impossible. His son, his Nicholas, was speaking, and he was calling Maria, the maid, Mama. The revelation shook David to his core. He observed Maria and Nicholas with a new intense scrutiny, a mix of profound gratitude and unsettling confusion swirling within him. Nicholas, after that initial breakthrough, slowly began to vocalize more with Maria. Not full sentences, but sounds, simple words pointing to objects, even hums and giggles. He would follow Maria around, a small shadow, his hand often reaching for hers. He still had his moments of withdrawal. His sensory sensitivities remained, but the impenetrable wall around him was cracking. Maria, meanwhile, sensed David's shifting gaze, the questions in his silence. She knew she had stumbled upon something far greater than just a nanny-child bond. The pieces of her own past, her nursing training, the subtle inconsistencies in Nicholas's diagnosis, all began to coalesce into a deeply troubling picture. One evening, after David had left for a late-night call-out, a restless energy compelled Maria to investigate. She remembered seeing a heavy, leather-bound folder on David's desk in his study, tucked away beneath some old fire service manuals. Guided by an instinct she couldn't ignore, she carefully retrieved it. Inside, beneath layers of dust and forgotten papers, she found it. A medical report, significantly older than Dr. Johnson's, dated just weeks after Sarah's accident. It was from a doctor, Mark Anderson, a respected pediatric neurologist at a county hospital, known for his ethical practice. The report detailed Nicholas's initial assessments. It meticulously outlined symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction with selective mutism, a direct psychological response to severe trauma, further complicated by a sensory processing disorder, SPD. The prognosis was clear. With a consistent, loving, and predictable environment, combined with gentle, play-based therapy focused on emotional security and sensory regulation, Nicholas was predicted to make a full recovery, regaining his speech and emotional equilibrium within a year. There was no mention of CDD, no need for the powerful long-term medications Dr. Johnson had prescribed. Maria's blood ran cold. The implications were horrifying. Dr. B. Johnson's diagnosis was not just wrong, it was a deliberate, calculated misdirection. She knew with chilling certainty what this meant. The Johnson Institute, a vast network of clinics and research facilities, also had a pharmaceutical division that manufactured specialized long-term medications for neurological disorders, specifically those linked to autism spectrum conditions. Nicholas, the son of a prominent community figure, had been turned into a long-term patient, a living case study for their profitable drug regimens, his genuine treatable condition deliberately masked by a more severe, permanent diagnosis. The injustice of it, the callous exploitation of a grieving father and a traumatized child, made her stomach churn. The shadows of her own past, the false accusations that had cost her everything, now loomed large, a grim mirror reflecting a familiar pattern of corruption and medical malpractice. She knew she had to show David. But how? And what would happen when he learned the truth? The morning air in the Miller cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Maria, driven by a fierce ethical imperative and the chilling echoes of her own past injustice, knew she couldn't wait. She approached David in his study, the faded manila folder containing Dr. Anderson's original report held tightly in her hands. David, exhausted from a 36-hour shift, looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face etched with worry. "Mr. Miller," Maria began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins, "we must talk about Nicholas, about his diagnosis, and the very real possibility of a calculated deceit." She placed the old report on his desk, pointing a firm finger at the clear headings. Acute stress reaction with selective mutism and sensory processing disorder, SPD. This is the truth, David. Dr. Johnson's diagnosis of childhood disintegrative disorder, it's a lie, a profitable one. David's reaction wasn't immediate disbelief. It was a slow, terrifying unraveling. He recognized the name Dr. Anderson, a respected figure whose initial consultation he'd dismissed after Dr. Johnson, his longtime family acquaintance, had swept in with her more severe diagnosis and institutional authority. He read the prognosis, full recovery expected within a year, and then looked at the stacks of expensive medication and invoices on his desk, the years of pain, the dwindling savings. A wave of gut-wrenching betrayal washed over him, followed by a searing firefighter's rage. He felt the fool, a man used to assessing danger, utterly blinded by trust and grief. He immediately placed a call to Dr. Anderson, who, after a quick review of his old files, confirmed sending the initial accurate report to Dr. Johnson's office for professional courtesy and follow-up, never realizing it had been suppressed and overridden. The confirmation hit David like a backdraft. David's resolve hardened instantly. He didn't just confront Dr. Johnson, he declared war. He hired a specialized team of legal and medical forensic auditors, pouring his last remaining resources, and even accepting a small anonymous community loan into the fight. Simultaneously, Dr. Johnson, a master manipulator, launched her counterattack. Leveraging her influential network and vast resources, she orchestrated a vicious smear campaign against Maria. Local news outlets suddenly ran stories about an unlicensed foreign caregiver with a dubious past, who was emotionally compromising the vulnerable son of a hero firefighter. They selectively pulled details from Maria's old, trumped-up case, twisting facts about a patient death that had led to her nursing license revocation overseas, painting her as negligent and dangerous. A social services investigation was launched, based on an anonymous tip, almost certainly from Johnson, forcing a temporary injunction that immediately removed Maria from the Miller home pending review. The separation was devastating. Nicholas, who had just begun to unfurl, snapped back into silence, his budding verbal communication vanishing. He suffered severe withdrawal and anxiety, refusing to eat and exhibiting violent headbanging against his crib, a clear physical manifestation of his immense fear and sensory distress. David, watching his son regress to a state far worse than before, understood the true stakes of the conflict. It wasn't just about money or reputation, it was about his son's life and Maria's destroyed professional standing. He realized the smear campaign against Maria was not only revenge but a calculated attempt to discredit the only witness who could expose the fraud. David's legal team, fueled by his desperate determination, dove deep into the Johnson Institute's financial records and internal communications. What they uncovered was a staggering web of systemic corruption. Dr. Johnson wasn't just misdiagnosing Nicholas. She was operating a widespread scheme where she and her associates routinely inflated diagnoses to severe, chronic, and uncurable conditions across multiple young patients. This ensured they remained lifelong clients of the Johnson Institute's therapy centers and perpetual consumers of pharmaceuticals manufactured by a shell company the Institute secretly controlled. They found emails detailing the specific instructions to suppress Dr. Anderson's report and elevate Nicholas's case as a marketing triumph for their drug line. Furthermore, David's team managed to access the full, untampered investigative reports from Maria's foreign nursing case. The findings were conclusive. The infant death had been due to an undetected genetic condition, and Maria's questioning of the clinic's outdated medication protocols at the time was the true reason. Dr. Johnson, who was consulting for that specific hospital's supply chain, had targeted and destroyed her career. It was all about protecting the bottom line. David, rejecting the quiet legal settlement Dr. Johnson frantically offered, took the evidence to a prominent investigative journalist in the state capital, a man known for his tenacious pursuit of corporate crime. The story broke like a wildfire across the region. Billion-dollar medical fraud exposed, children misdiagnosed for profit. Patient families came forward in droves, recognizing the chilling pattern. Years of expensive, ineffective therapies and debilitating medications prescribed for conditions their children likely didn't have. Dr. Patricia Johnson and several of her senior associates were arrested and charged with multiple counts of insurance fraud, medical malpractice, and obstruction of justice. The public outcry led to the shuttering of the Johnson Institute, The legal system moved swiftly and decisively. In a landmark civil case, Dr. Johnson was stripped of her medical license, ordered to pay tens of millions in restitution, and ultimately received a substantial prison sentence, a fate she tried to avoid but couldn't escape under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Maria was completely vindicated. Her professional nursing license was fully restored, along with a formal public apology from the Foreign Medical Board that had initially sanctioned her. 2 weeks after her exoneration, Maria was back at the Oakhaven cabin. When Nicholas saw her walk through the front door, he didn't run, but he stopped his perpetual rocking motion. He looked at her, his big eyes wide, and then slowly, with painful effort, he reached out his arms and said, his voice stronger than before, "Maria, safe." Maria rushed to him, enveloping him in a secure, comforting hug. David stood back, tears blurring his vision, witnessing the true, genuine cure unfold, a cure of consistency, safety, and fierce, protective love. Together, David and Maria established the Oakhaven Foundation, dedicated to providing free, ethical, play-based emotional trauma and sensory therapy to children in the region, ensuring no other family fell victim to predatory medical practices. David restructured his finances, managing his life and fire duties more carefully, focusing on being truly present. Maria, with her restored credentials, became the Foundation's clinical director. Her passion now focused on healing children using genuine compassion instead of fraudulent protocol. Years passed. Nicholas, now a tall, healthy 16-year-old, not only spoke fluently, but excelled as a junior counselor at the Foundation's summer camp, exhibiting an uncanny empathy for the younger, withdrawn children. His speech therapist once joked he was the most verbal patient she'd ever had. At the Foundation's 5-year anniversary gala, a crowded, hopeful event held in the fire station's large hall, Nicholas stepped onto the stage. He held the old plastic stethoscope, the one that had started it all. Looking out at the audience, he spoke with the clear, steady voice of a young man who had found his place in the world.